When we usually think about history, the really big, sweeping epochs of human civilization, I mean, we tend to imagine it like this massive, slow-moving glacier.
Right. Yeah, like it's just centuries of gradual demographic change
Hmm.
or, slowly evolving philosophical ideas.
Exactly. The kind of history that takes like 500 years to actually leave a mark.
Right, like the slow rise and fall of the Roman Republic turning into an empire, or
Yeah.
the Silk Road spreading out over generations.
But then you look at the historical record and you find these bizarre anomalies. You find these microscopic, highly concentrated moments in time.
Yeah, these little compressed nodes.
Right. A single isolated week taking place in a tiny, dusty backwater province of the Roman Empire that somehow acts like a fulcrum.
Hmm.
You press down on the events of that one specific week, and the entire world just flips. The glacier metaphor completely breaks down, and what you have is a localized earthquake.
As historical earthquake, yeah.
The timeline actually fractures into a definitive before and an after, and it sends out these sociological and theological shockwaves that, honestly, we're still measuring today.
Well, it's what historians and sociologists often refer to as a hinge point,
Mhm.
The entire door of Western civilization swings on the events of just a few days in early first century Jerusalem.
Which is exactly what we are unpacking today for you. We're going on a deep dive into a comprehensive synthesis of the historical, archaeological, and literary data surrounding what is pretty universally known as the Passion of Christ.
Right.
Now, I want to be super clear about our mission here.
Right.
We aren't looking at this to, deliver a theological sermon to you.
No, not at all.
We are looking at an incredibly dense textual compilation drawn from 4 ancient biographers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to figure out how this story actually works under the hood.
Because it's a fascinating piece of literature.
Exactly. We're going to deconstruct the gritty, brutal mechanics of Roman occupation, the intensely complex socio-religious structures of first-century Judaism, and the brilliant literary artistry used to document the final week of the life of Jesus of Nazareth.
And the documents we're dealing with here, so that's chapters 26 through 28 of Matthew, 14 through 16 of Mark, 22 through 24 of Luke, and 13 through 21 of John. They're fascinating precisely because they completely refuse to separate the physical dirt of reality from their sweeping theological claims.
They marry the grit of an execution to this high-level philosophy.
Exactly. They anchor it in the dirt.
So we have to start with the dirt. Before we can talk about the meaning of the cross, we need to know if the hill it stood on actually existed.
Right. We need a baseline.
Right. According to the historical consensus in our source material, we do have an established baseline. Jesus of Nazareth died in Jerusalem around the year 30 CE or potentially 33 CE.
Mm-hmm.
And this execution was signed off by a Roman prefect named Pontius Pilate, while the local religious proceedings were headed by a high priest named Caiaphas.
And those specific names and dates, they act as anchors. This narrative, it refuses to operate like a myth.
It's not once upon a time.
Right. It doesn't begin with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It essentially says, during the administration of this specific governor under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, in this specific geographic zip code, this event happened.
To really understand the role of archaeology here, I want you to think about it like finding an old ticket stub in a shoebox in your grandfather's attic.
Oh, I like this analogy.
Let's say it's a faded, torn ticket stub to the 1969 Woodstock Festival. Holding that little piece of paper in your hand does not tell you what Jimi Hendrix's guitar sounded like.
No, of course not.
It doesn't capture the smell of the mud or, the feeling of the Cultural Revolution happening in the crowd. It can't prove the meaning of the music to you.
Right.
But what that ticket stub absolutely does do, undeniably, is prove that the venue existed. It proves the concert wasn't just a myth. It anchors the legendary stories into a tangible, verifiable reality.
That's actually the perfect framework for archaeological evidence. The artifacts we pull out of the ground in the Middle East do not, and honestly cannot, prove the spiritual claims of the texts.
You can't dig up a stone that proves a sin was forgiven.
Exactly. You can't prove an atonement occurred with a shovel. But these artifacts act as historical ticket stubs. They prove that the gospel writers were operating in a hyper-realistic, verified, first-century Roman Judean context.
So let's look at the first of these ticket stubs, the Pilate inscription. Because for centuries, skeptics pointed out that outside of the New Testament and a few brief mentions in historians like Tacitus and Josephus, There was almost zero physical evidence that Pontius Pilate even existed.
He was a ghost in the archaeological record.
Right. Then, in 1961, archaeologists are excavating an ancient Roman theater at Caesarea Maritima, which is right on the coast of the Mediterranean.
And Caesarea Maritima is vital to understand the whole political dynamic. It was essentially the Roman headquarters for the province of Judea.
They didn't live in Jerusalem.
No. The Roman governors hated staying in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was inland, it was hot, religiously tense, and completely foreign to a Roman aristocrat.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So Pilate and his predecessors built this beautiful coastal city. It had ocean breezes, a massive harbor, Roman temples. He really only traveled up the mountain to Jerusalem when he absolutely had to, which was usually just during the Jewish festivals to ensure the crowds didn't riot.
So they are digging in the ruins of this coastal theater,
Sure.
right? And they flip over a piece of limestone that had been repurposed as a stair step,
Mm-hmm.
and carved into it, plain as day in Latin, is a dedicatory inscription. It mentions a building dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius, and it names the man who commissioned it Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea.
Bam. Ticket stub number one.
It's sitting there as a stair.
And it completely silenced the debate about his existence. It places a man with the exact title the Gospels give him, in the exact region at the exact time.
It verifies the whole political authority structure.
Right. That Judea was under the iron grip of a Roman administrator who held the absolute power of capital punishment.
So we move from the Roman headquarters on the coast to the religious headquarters in Jerusalem for ticket stub number 2. We are talking about the Caiaphas ossuary. And I think the mechanics of how this was found and what it actually is are just mind-blowing.
Yeah, the burial customs of first-century elite families in Jerusalem were incredibly specific and a bit morbid to our modern sensibilities.
How so?
Well, when a family member died, the body wasn't buried in the ground in a casket. It was placed inside a rock-hewn tomb, laid out on a stone bench, and sealed in with spices.
Which sounds exactly like the burial of Jesus that we'll get to a bit later.
Precisely. But here is the second phase of that custom. After about a year, once the flesh had completely decomposed, the family would re-enter the tomb.
Wow.
They would gather the dry bones and place them into a small, intricately carved limestone box called an ossuary. This allowed multiple generations of a family to be stored in a single family cave.
So it's like a space-saving measure for tombs.
Exactly. So in 1990, workers were widening a road in the Peace Forest, which is just south of the old city of Jerusalem, and a tractor broke through the roof of a first-century burial cave.
And inside, archaeologists find several of these bone boxes, but one of them is just spectacular. It's incredibly ornate, decorated with carved rosettes, clearly belonging to someone of immense wealth and status.
And scratched into the side, in Aramaic, is the inscription, Joseph, son of Caiaphas.
The high priest.
Yes. The historian Josephus tells us that the high priest who organized the plot against Jesus was named Joseph Caiaphas. Finding this ossuary is literally like finding the private family vault of the lead prosecutor in the narrative.
That's wild.
It corroborates the existence of this specific, deeply entrenched, powerful high priestly aristocracy that controlled the Temple Mount.
Okay, that brings us to the third artifact, and this one is far more visceral and honestly disturbing than a stone box or a carved inscription. The Yohanan crucifixion remains.
Yeah, this one is heavy.
It takes the literary concept of the cross and turns it into a terrifying physical reality.
So in 1968, in a neighborhood in northern Jerusalem, another burial cave was uncovered. And inside an ossuary belonging to a man named Yehohanan, physical anthropologists found a human heel bone.
But it wasn't just a bone.
No. Driven laterally, straight through the calcaneus, the heel bone was a massive, rusted 7-inch iron nail.
And attached to the head of the nail were fragments of olive wood.
Right. The forensic reconstruction of this is chilling. When the Roman executioners nailed Yohanan to the vertical beam of his cross, the iron nail hit a hard knot in the olive wood.
It bent the nail.
The tip of the nail bent, creating a hook. So when the man finally died, perhaps days later, the soldiers couldn't pull the nail out of the wood without completely destroying the corpse's foot.
Oh.
So they simply took an axe, chopped the wood around the nail, and gave the body back to the family with the nail and a chunk of the cross still permanently fused to the bone.
I mean, no one is arguing this is Jesus' heel bone. The name on the box is Yehohanan. But what this artifact does is rip away centuries of sanitized, gold-plated, artistic depictions of the cross.
It makes it horribly real.
It proves that the Romans were actually doing this in Jerusalem in the first century, exactly the way the text described. It was a terrifying, flesh-tearing, mechanical process.
Absolutely. These three artifacts, the pilot stone, the Caiaphas ossuary, and the pierced heel bone, they anchor the story. We aren't dealing with a mythic realm. We are dealing with real politicians, real religious authorities, and the real Roman war machine.
But having the physical names and locations verified in the dirt only tells us the where and the who. You
All
know,
right.
to understand the why these specific men colluded to execute a rural street preacher, we have to look at the economy and the sociology of the city itself. The dirt is just the stage. We need to understand the mood of the actors.
And the psychological environment of first-century Jerusalem is paramount here. You are dealing with a strict honor-shame culture.
How does that work in practice?
Well, in the modern West, we tend to prioritize individual authenticity, wealth, personal truth. But in the ancient Mediterranean, your most valuable currency, the thing that kept you alive, fed, and protected, was your public honor.
It's kind of like cancel culture, but with lethal consequences.
That's a great way to put it. If you lose your reputation, you don't just lose followers on social media, you lose your livelihood, your family's protection, your entire social safety net.
You experience social death.
Exactly, which usually leads to actual starvation or violence. So every interaction is a highly public negotiation of status.
So when a rabbi from Galilee rides into Jerusalem and starts publicly dismantling the theological arguments of the elite priests in front of massive crowds.
He isn't just winning a debate.
Yeah.
He is systematically stripping them of their honor. He is bankrupting their social capital in real time.
And he's doing it during the worst possible week of the year.
Yeah.
The text sets this entire narrative during the festival of Passover. Talk about the logistics of the Passover economy, because my understanding from the sources is that Jerusalem basically turned into a powder keg.
Oh, completely. First century Jerusalem was a modest city, perhaps 40 to 50,000 permanent residents. But during Passover, Jewish pilgrims from all over the known world, Egypt, Rome, Asia Minor, they flooded into the city to offer sacrifices at the temple.
So the population explodes.
Some ancient historians estimate the population swelled to hundreds of thousands, maybe even over 1 million.
The infrastructure would just collapse under that weight.
It's a logistical nightmare. Every single inn is booked, families are camping in the hills and fields surrounding the city walls, and the local commerce skyrockets.
Right, because of the temple tax.
Yes, you have an incredibly complex exchange rate system because pilgrims bring foreign coins bearing the image of the Roman emperor or pagan gods, which cannot be used in the Holy Temple. So money changers set up tables to convert Roman denarii into temple currency at exorbitant markups.
And then there's the livestock.
You have tens of thousands of sheep being herded through the narrow, dusty streets for the Passover slaughter. The noise is deafening. The smell of blood and roasting meat hangs over the entire city.
It's sensory overload.
And culturally, remember what Passover actually celebrates.
Yeah.
It is the annual remembrance of the God of Israel violently liberating his people from a foreign superpower, the Egyptians.
Okay, this is the missing puzzle piece right here. It's a National Independence Day celebration, but they are currently occupied by a new superpower.
The nationalist fervor is at an absolute boiling point. Every pilgrim in that city is praying for a new Moses to rise up, crush the Roman legions, and restore the kingdom of David. The zealot factions are itching for a riot. They literally have daggers hidden in their cloaks.
This completely reframes the actions of the religious elite for me. If I'm Caiaphas, I'm basically a middle manager.
Right.
My boss is Rome. Rome gave me the keys to the temple, the wealth, and the status. But Rome's one role is keep the tax revenue flowing and keep the peace.
And Pilate has moved his troops up from the coast. They are standing on the walls of the Antonia fortress, literally looking down into the temple courtyards, hands on their swords, watching the crowds.
Just waiting.
If a riot breaks out, Pilate won't send in riot police with tear gas. He will send in heavy infantry to massacre thousands of people.
So when Jesus arrives, drawing crowds of thousands who are shouting Hosanna, which literally means save us now, and he starts flipping the tables of the money changers, disrupting the temple economy, he isn't just a theological nuisance.
No, he is a walking national security threat. In the Gospel of John, chapter 11, the High Council holds a crisis meeting.
Yeah.
Their explicit fears recorded plainly. They say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation.
Pure panic.
Caiaphas famously argues that it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish.
It's pure, cynical, utilitarian political calculus.
They calculate that executing Jesus is the only way to release the pressure valve and appease the Romans. It's a collision of kingdoms. Jesus is preaching the kingdom of God, a kingdom of radical self-sacrifice and spiritual renewal. But the religious elite and the Romans, they only understand the kingdoms of this world kingdoms maintained by leverage, violence, and institutional preservation.
Now, dealing with the historical responsibility for this execution requires incredible care.
Yes, it does.
Because for centuries, this very text was manipulated to justify horrific violence and anti-Semitism. But if you actually read the source material objectively, it refuses to scapegoat a single demographic. It distributes the blame in a very specific way.
The narrative carefully constructs a web of shared systemic human corruption.
Right.
You have the institutional self-preservation of the Jewish High Court, who orchestrate the arrest and push for the death penalty to protect their status. But you have the absolute, undeniable judicial and physical reality of Roman execution.
Pilate is the one who gives the legal order. Roman soldiers drive the nails. Roman soldiers mock him.
The text indicts the entire human power structure. The religious authorities represent the pinnacle of human morality and law, and the Roman Empire represents the pinnacle of human governance and civilization.
And both systems look at an innocent man and decide it is more expedient to torture him to death than to risk their own power. We are just imparting what the text says here, but it's a profound indictment.
Right. But overlapping all of that human political treachery is the overarching theological claim of the text's divine sovereignty. The writers insist that while the humans were making evil, calculated choices, this was simultaneously the unfolding of God's redemptive purpose for the world.
It's a fascinating paradox. The worst crime in history is simultaneously the mechanism for the world's salvation. That's a heavy concept to document.
Very heavy.
Which brings up the inevitable question, who is actually writing this down? The collision of Rome, Jerusalem, and Jesus left a crater in human history, but we only know about it because of the authors who recorded it. Let's look at the 4 unique literary lenses that captured this event.
The canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written in the decades following the events, generally placed by historians between the 60s and the 90s CE.
So they aren't just detached police reports.
No, they are highly sophisticated theological biographies.
Let's ditch the old cliche of comparing them to 4 different camera angles. I think a much better analogy for how these documents function is a courtroom trial.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine an event happens, a massive corporate scandal or a complex crime, and you call 4 different expert witnesses to the stand. They all witness the exact same event, but their backgrounds, their professions, and the specific jury they are trying to persuade completely change how they tell the story.
That is a phenomenal way to understand gospel authorship.
Yeah.
Each author has a very specific demographic they are addressing, a distinct problem they are trying to solve in their community. Let's bring your first witness to the stand, the Gospel of Matthew.
Right. If Matthew is on the witness stand, he is the forensic accountant. He is meticulous. His primary audience is Jewish Christians who are experiencing immense pushback from their surrounding synagogue communities. They are being told that following Jesus is a break from their ancestral faith. So Matthew's job on the stand is to prove the paper trail.
And he does. Matthew's narrative is saturated with fulfillment citations. Throughout the arrest, the trials, and the crucifixion, Matthew repeatedly pauses the action to say, "This happened to fulfill what was spoken by the prophets."
He links the 30 pieces of silver back to the prophet Zechariah.
He links the mocking of the crowd to the Psalms. Matthew is methodically demonstrating that Jesus isn't an anomaly or a failed rebel. He is the precise, calculated culmination of the entire Hebrew Bible. He is the true Davidic king establishing the new covenant.
So Matthew is showing the receipts. Now, what happens when Mark takes the stand?
Mark is the breathless, traumatized 911 caller.
Oh, wow, that's dark.
It is. Mark's gospel is believed to be the earliest, likely written to Christians in Rome who are facing the horrific, violent persecutions of Emperor Nero. Mark doesn't have time for long genealogies or philosophical prologues. His favorite Greek word is euthys, immediately.
The pacing in Mark gives you whiplash.
It does. Mark's lens on the passion is incredibly dark, stark, and terrifying. He wants to show his persecuted audience that Jesus understands their terror. In Mark, Jesus is the deeply suffering, largely silent Son of God who experiences profound cosmic abandonment.
The disciples completely fail him.
The crowds turn on him. He dies screaming in the dark. Mark's ultimate point is that true discipleship means following Jesus into the very heart of suffering. It's not a theology of glory. It's a theology of the cross.
If Matthew is the accountant and Mark is the 911 caller, Luke is the investigative journalist.
Right.
Luke literally opens his gospel by stating he has carefully investigated everything from the beginning to write an orderly account. He's a highly educated physician writing for a broader, sophisticated Greco-Roman audience.
And Luke knows exactly what his audience values. In the Greco-Roman world, the ultimate philosophical ideal was the noble death.
Think of Socrates calmly drinking the hemlock, completely unbothered by his unjust execution.
Exactly. Luke taps into that cultural framework, but elevates it. He presents Jesus as the ultimate innocent, righteous sufferer.
Luke really focuses on the innocence. He highlights that Pilate declares Jesus innocent 3 separate times. He notes that Herod finds no fault in him. Even the Roman centurion at the cross says, "Surely this was a righteous man."
Beyond innocence, Luke highlights Jesus' radical mercy, even in the midst of torture. Only Luke records Jesus healing the severed ear of the high priest's servant during the chaotic arrest in the dark.
That's a profound detail.
Only Luke records Jesus stopping on the agonizing walk to Golgotha to comfort the weeping women of Jerusalem. And only Luke records Jesus turning his head on the cross to offer salvation to the criminal being executed next to him. Luke is showing a fractured empire what true divine compassion looks like under the worst possible duress.
Which brings us to the final witness, John. If the other 3 are piecing together the timeline and the emotions on the ground, John is the CEO explaining the ultimate master plan from a 30,000-foot view.
John's Gospel is written much later, likely toward the end of the 1st century, reflecting decades of deep spiritual meditation. John's narrative is utterly unique because in his account of the Passion, Jesus is never, for a single second, a victim.
Right. In the other accounts, things happen to Jesus. In John, Jesus orchestrates everything.
The theme of John is absolute sovereignty and divine glory. When the armed mob comes to arrest him in the garden, they ask for Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus replies with the divine name, I am, and John records that the sheer force of that declaration physically knocks the entire mob to the ground.
That's an incredible image.
Throughout the Roman trial, Jesus effectively puts Pilate on trial. John's theology dictates that the cross is not a tragic defeat that God magically reverses 3 days later. For John, the cross is the throne. The crucifixion is the exact moment of Jesus' exaltation and glorification.
So, the authors are using these different lenses, but they all employ a shared literary brilliance. The dramatic irony throughout these texts is staggering. Think about the reversal motif.
Yeah, let's look at that.
The religious leaders blindfold Jesus, hit him, and sarcastically demand, "Prophesy who hit you." They think they are mocking a fake prophet, entirely unaware that their very actions are fulfilling the prophecies about the suffering servant.
And the Roman soldiers weave a crown out of massive, flesh-tearing thorns. They throw a cheap purple robe over his shredded back, put a reed in his hand as a fake scepter, and bow down laughing, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews."
The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife.
The soldiers think it's a hilarious geopolitical joke. The reader knows that the man bleeding on the pavement is literally the king of the cosmos. The entire system of worldly power is inverted. The judge is judged, so the guilty can go free.
And all of this sweeping theology is grounded in the ticking clock of a single week. Let's merge these 4 witnesses and track the timeline. We move from Palm Sunday, where he is welcomed as a king, to Monday's absolute disruption of the Temple Mount.
Tuesday is filled with escalating hostile debates with the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Wednesday is quiet, likely the day Judas finalizes the betrayal contract. And then we hit Thursday evening. The sun goes down, and the theological density skyrockets in an upper room in Jerusalem.
The Last Supper. At its core, this is a Passover meal. The Greek word is pascha. As we discussed, this is the foundational dinner party of the Jewish faith.
Every element on the table is a symbol of the Exodus.
The bitter herbs for the bitterness of slavery. The unleavened bread representing the haste of their escape. And the roasted lamb, whose blood had been painted on their doorposts in Egypt so the angel of death would pass over their homes.
They had been eating this meal for over 1,000 years. But the texts record Jesus doing something absolutely scandalous. He stops the liturgy, takes the bread and the wine, and completely re-engineers the meaning of the meal around his own impending execution.
He takes the cup of wine and says, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." To a first-century Jewish ear, this is a mind-bending claim.
Why is that so shocking?
The Greek word for covenant is diatheko. In the ancient Near East, covenants weren't just signed on paper, they were cut in blood. When Moses ratified the covenant between God and Israel at Mount Sinai, he sacrificed animals and literally threw the blood on the people.
It was a visceral, visual pledge. If I break this promise, let what happened to this animal happen to me.
Exactly. Jesus is linking back to Sinai, but he's also looking back to the prophet Jeremiah, who promised that one day God would make a new covenant, one where the law wasn't written on stone tablets but on the human heart, and where sins were permanently forgiven.
So Jesus is stating that his own body is the sacrifice that will activate this new era of human history.
Right.
Now, if we're doing a deep dive into the source material, I have to bring up the famous calendar debate. Because if you read these four accounts closely, there seems to be a massive contradiction regarding exactly when this meal happened.
Yes. The chronology of the Last Supper is one of the most hotly debated interpretive issues in New Testament scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are very explicit. They frame the Last Supper unequivocally as the official Passover meal. They are eating the Passover lamb.
But the Gospel of John throws a wrench into that timeline.
John's timeline is shifted. In John's account, when the Jewish leaders take Jesus to Pilate the next morning, they refuse to enter the Roman headquarters because they don't want to be ritually defiled. Why? Because they want to be able to eat the Passover meal that upcoming evening.
Oh, wow.
John explicitly states that Jesus is crucified on the day of preparation for the Passover, which means he is bleeding on the cross at the exact hour. The priests are slaughtering the Passover lambs in the temple.
So how do historians reconcile this? Did he eat the meal on Thursday night, or was he the meal on Friday afternoon? Again, we're just reporting the scholarly debate here.
Well, scholarship generally splits into two camps. The first camp focuses on historical harmonization. They point out that first-century Judaism was not a monolith. Different sects used different calendars.
Like who?
The Essenes, a strict sectarian group, used a solar calendar, while the official temple used a lunar calendar. It is entirely plausible that Jesus and his disciples, perhaps following a Galilean or sectarian tradition, legally celebrated the Passover a day earlier than the aristocratic priests in Jerusalem.
So it could just be a regional calendar quirk. What is the second theory?
The second camp argues for theological shaping. They suggest that John intentionally, brilliantly altered the historical timeline to make a profound theological point. John wants to ensure his readers understand the cosmic reality. Jesus is the ultimate Passover lamb.
So he moves the timeline to match the metaphor.
To make that point undeniable, John syncs the timeline so the execution of Jesus happens simultaneously with the temple sacrifices. For John, the theological truth supersedes chronological rigidity.
Regardless of the exact calendar date, the meal ends. They sing a hymn, leave the upper room, cross the Kidron Valley, and enter an olive grove at the base of the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane.
The name literally means olive press.
And the imagery here is terrifying. Jesus is being psychologically and spiritually crushed.
It is the moment of ultimate psychological terror. Jesus falls to the ground and prays, asking the Father to remove this cup from him. The Greek word is poterion. This is vital. He isn't just afraid of the Roman whips.
Right, it's deeper than that.
In the Hebrew prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the cup is a recurring metaphor for the concentrated wrath and terrifying judgment of God against human evil. Jesus is staring into the abyss of absorbing that cosmic judgment.
People often picture Jesus as perfectly calm and stoic, just calmly accepting his fate. But the texts destroy that image. He is in absolute agony.
The physician Luke includes a medical detail. Jesus is in such extreme psychological distress that his sweat becomes like great drops of blood falling to the ground.
Wait, really? Is that a real condition?
This is a rare but documented medical condition called hematidrosis, where severe anxiety triggers the rupture of capillary blood vessels that feed the sweat glands. The terror is literally bleeding out of his pores. He's wrestling with the divine will, the Greek word theloma. Yet at the apex of this terror, he submits, "Not my will, but yours be done."
The moment he says those words, the darkness descends. Torches appear through the olive trees. Judas arrives with an armed mob from the chief priests. And right here, the survey highlights a specific Greek word that acts like the structural spine for the rest of the narrative.
Paradidumi.
Paradidumi means to hand over, to deliver up, or to betray.
I picture it like a relay baton in the darkest, most tragic race ever run. Look at how this baton of betrayal moves. First, Judas hands over Jesus to the temple guards.
The guards take him, and the chief priests hand over Jesus to Pontius Pilate. Pilate interrogates him, caves to the crowd, and hands over Jesus to the Roman executioners. The human beings in this story are just passing this dark baton of hostility down the line.
It's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
But the texts present an earth-shattering paradox here. While human beings are maliciously and cowardly passing this baton of betrayal, the early Christian writers like Paul in his epistles and Peter in the book of Acts argue that it was actually God the Father who handed him over for the sake of the world.
Wait, so the corrupt political actions of these men are somehow the exact instruments of divine salvation?
Yes. The sheer malice of human treachery is hijacked by divine providence to accomplish redemption. It is the ultimate mystery of the cross. And notice the literary shift that happens at the arrest.
What shift?
Up until this moment, Jesus is the active agent of the story. He is teaching, flipping tables, organizing the supper, and praying in the garden. But once he is handed over, the grammar of the narrative shifts to the passive voice.
Ah, I see.
He is bound. He is led. He is struck. He is crucified. He enters the grinding machinery of the justice system.
Let's dissect that machinery. We're looking at the anatomy of a completely broken judicial process. It happens in the dead of night, which is incredibly illegal according to Jewish law. They take him first to Annas.
Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas. He had been deposed as high priest by the Romans years earlier, but he still controlled the temple wealth like a mafia don. He held the real power.
So he's pulling the strings.
Annas interrogates him, finds nothing, and sends him bound to the current high priest, Caiaphas, where the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, has been illegally assembled in the middle of the night.
They bring in false witnesses, but they can't even get their lies to match up. Meanwhile, the survey points out a devastating parallel scene happening right outside in the courtyard. While Jesus is inside facing the Supreme Court of his nation, Peter, his lead disciple, the man who promised he would die for him just a few hours earlier, is warming his hands by a charcoal fire.
This is a masterpiece of narrative contrast. Inside, Jesus is facing the most powerful man in the nation. Outside, Peter is confronted by a servant girl, a nobody in the social hierarchy. She recognizes his Galilean accent and asks if he was with Jesus.
And Peter just completely fractures. The panic of the honor-shame culture takes over. If he admits it, he will be arrested and likely crucified too.
The instinct for self-preservation completely overpowers his loyalty. He denies knowing Jesus 3 times, escalating his denial until he is swearing oaths and calling down curses upon himself. Peter's failure is total and public.
While inside, Jesus is demonstrating the exact opposite.
Jesus is asked directly by the high priest, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus breaks his silence and gives what the Greek terms martyria, faithful testimony. He says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven."
Which is a direct quotation of the prophet Daniel. He is claiming divine authority over the very men judging him.
He gives the faithful testimony that guarantees his death, while Peter gives the false testimony that temporarily saves his own skin. The high priest tears his robes, a sign of blasphemy, and they condemn him to death.
But, as we established, they are a subjugated people. They don't have the authority to carry out capital punishment. So, as the sun rises on Friday morning, they pass the baton, they drag him to the praetorium to face Pontius Pilate.
And Pilate finds himself trapped in an impossible political dilemma. The Jewish leaders drag Jesus in, but they don't charge him with blasphemy. Pilate wouldn't care about a Jewish theological dispute.
So what do?
They twist the charge into treason against Rome. They claim Jesus is forbidding the payment of taxes and declaring himself a king.
Which is a brilliant manipulative move. Pilate has to investigate a claim of treason or his own head will end up on a spike.
So Pilate pulls Jesus aside for a private interrogation. And it is a fascinating philosophical standoff. Pilate asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replies that his kingdom is not of this world. If it were, his servants would be fighting.
He says he came into the world to bear witness to the truth.
Pilate, the cynical, battle-hardened politician, scoffs and asks, "What is truth?" He looks at a battered, bleeding Galilean and sees absolutely no military threat to the Roman legions. Pilate goes back out to the mob and repeatedly declares, "I find no guilt in him."
If he knows Jesus is innocent and he's the guy with all the swords, why doesn't he just let him go? We discussed his fear of riots, but there's a specific political threat the Jewish leaders use here that seals the deal.
They scream, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." This wasn't just an insult. Friend of Caesar was a formal political title.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And you have to look at the historical background of Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was notoriously paranoid. He had recently executed his own right-hand man, Sejanus, for treason, and was purging anyone associated with him.
So Pilate's career was already on thin ice due to previous violent blunders in Jerusalem?
The threat from the priests is clear. Execute this man, or we'll send an envoy to Emperor Tiberius claiming you are harboring a rival king.
It's blackmail, pure and simple.
Pilate is forced to choose between abstract justice for a peasant or his own wealth, power, and literal survival. He caves. He calls for a bowl of water, washes his hands in front of the crowd in a pathetic, symbolic attempt to absolve himself of the murder, and sentences an innocent man to the cross.
The order is given. Jesus is brutally scourged with a Roman flagrum, a whip embedded with lead and bone designed to rip the flesh off the back. He carries the heavy crossbeam through the streets and is nailed to the cross at Golgotha, the place of a skull.
And we need to spend some time on the mechanics of Roman crucifixion. The Greek word is stauro, because today we have completely domesticated the cross. People wear it as gold jewelry.
But in the first century, it was the ultimate symbol of state-sponsored terror.
The Romans didn't invent crucifixion, but they perfected it as a tool of psychological warfare and social deterrence. It was meticulously engineered to maximize physical agony and delay death for as long as possible. Sometimes victims hung there for days, fighting for every single breath as their lungs slowly collapsed.
It's just horrific.
But the physical pain was only half the punishment. The primary function was social humiliation.
It was a billboard, a violent, bloody billboard along the main highway.
Exactly. The victim was stripped completely naked. They were positioned at eye level on busy intersections or highways so people could look them in the face, spit on them, and mock them.
And it was heavily class-based.
Highly stratified. Roman citizens were legally exempt from crucifixion, regardless of their crime. It was specifically reserved for slaves, disgraced soldiers, violent rebels, and those without any civic protection. To be crucified was to be deemed the lowest of the low, completely stripped of humanity. It was the empire's way of saying, this is what happens when you challenge Rome. You become meat.
The text records several moments from the cross as he hangs there for 6 hours. But there is one specific cry that happens right before the end, when the sky turns dark. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus screams in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me?
The Greek translation uses the word enkatolaipu, to abandon or leave behind. This is the absolute theological epicenter of the narrative, and it is the subject of intense debate.
And what's the debate about? We want to make sure we cover both sides impartially.
The debate centers on trying to comprehend what is happening within the nature of God at this exact moment. One theological view argues for what is called an ontological rupture within the Trinity.
Explain ontological rupture simply, because that sounds like heavy seminary jargon.
Put simply, it means a literal severing of being. Imagine the deepest, most fundamental bond of love in the universe, a parent and a child, who have existed in perfect unity forever. This view argues that because Jesus is taking on the repulsive sin of the entire world, God the Father, who is perfectly holy, literally turns his face away in disgust.
So the bond is broken.
He severs the relational bond. Jesus is cast into the outer darkness of absolute spiritual isolation. It is the experience of hell on the cross.
That is terrifying. What is the other view?
The other view points out that Jesus is directly quoting the opening line of Psalm 22. Any first-century Jew hearing that opening line would instantly know the rest of the song.
Oh, because they memorized the Psalms.
And Psalm 22 is a poem that begins in horrific agony and feelings of abandonment, but ends in triumphant vindication, with the sufferer praising God because God did not hide his face from him. So some scholars argue Jesus isn't experiencing a literal break in the Trinity. He is reciting a prayer of a righteous sufferer who trusts God will eventually save him.
So is he literally abandoned, or is he just singing a sad song with a happy ending?
The text seems to demand we hold the tension. The source material describes it as a genuine, horrific, objective experience of judgment and abandonment. He is truly bearing the curse. But he expresses that objective horror through the faithful words of the psalm. He doesn't curse God. He still cries out, "My God." Even in the pitch black of divine judgment, he remains the faithful son.
And a few moments later, in the Gospel of John, the ordeal reaches its conclusion with a single Greek word, tetelestai.
It is finished.
What does that word really mean in context?
In the ancient world, this word was written across business ledgers to mean paid in full. It was used by servants to say the task is complete and by generals to say the battle is won. It is not a gasp of defeat from a dying victim. It is a triumphant roar. The mission is accomplished. The debt is paid. The new covenant is secured. He bows his head and gives up his spirit.
If the narrative stopped there, on a Friday afternoon, Jesus of Nazareth would just be another tragic, forgotten footnote in the bloody history of the Roman machine.
Another idealist crushed by the real world.
Right. But the entire premise of the text, and the reason we are even having this conversation 2,000 years later, is that the tragedy of Friday is completely overthrown by the events of Sunday morning. This brings us to the final section, the empty tomb and covenant culmination.
The transition from Friday to Sunday hinges on the burial. The texts record that Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the very council that condemned Jesus, bravely approaches Pilate and asks for the body.
Which is a huge risk.
He and Nicodemus wrap the body in linen with 75 pounds of expensive spices. They lay him in a brand new, rock-hewn tomb, like the ones we discussed earlier with the ossuaries, and a massive stone is rolled across the entrance.
This detail is crucial for the historical record, right? Because it wasn't an anonymous mass grave for criminals.
Exactly. The location of the tomb was public knowledge.
Yeah.
Pilate even posts a Roman guard unit and a Roman seal on the stone to prevent grave robbery.
So the body is locked down, Saturday passes in silence, and then early Sunday morning, the narrative introduces a detail that modern historians find incredibly persuasive for its authenticity. The first people to arrive at the tomb, find the stone rolled away, and witness the resurrected Jesus are the women disciples. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James.
Historians call this the criterion of embarrassment. It is historically awkward in the best possible way.
Let's unpack why this is a massive PR disaster for the first century.
You have to understand the deeply patriarchal nature of the ancient Mediterranean world. In both Roman and Jewish culture, women were marginalized in public spaces. The testimony of a woman was generally considered unreliable and was often inadmissible in a court of law.
That's awful, but it's the reality of the time.
A prominent ancient critic of Christianity, Celsus, openly mocked the resurrection story, specifically because it relied on the hallucinations of a hysterical woman.
So if I am a first-century guy trying to invent a fake religion, and I need to convince a skeptical, patriarchal society that my dead leader actually came back to life, writing the story so that the foundational primary witnesses are women is the dumbest marketing strategy possible.
It would be narrative suicide. If you were inventing the myth, you would write that Peter, the strong male leader, stood at the tomb and heroically fought off the Roman guards as Jesus emerged. Or better yet, you would invent a story where Jesus appears directly to Pilate or Caiaphas to prove them wrong.
But they don't do that.
No, the only logical explanation for why the gospel authors would record that women were the first witnesses, knowing full well it would make their apologetics exponentially harder, is because they were bound to the historical truth. It happened that way, so they wrote it that way.
I love that. The truth is messy. Now, we need to clarify what these texts actually claim happened to the body. Because in modern casual conversations, people often soften the resurrection. They say, well, his spirit lived on in the memories of his friends, or it's a beautiful metaphor for spring and the renewal of the human spirit.
The Greek word used throughout the New Testament is anastasis. It literally means to stand up again. The gospel authors aggressively reject the idea of a purely spiritual or symbolic resurrection.
Why would they reject the spiritual idea?
The Greeks already had a concept of the immortal soul floating away to the afterlife. They thought the physical body was a prison. The text claims something much more scandalous: bodily vindication.
It's extremely physical. He isn't a ghost.
Luke records Jesus specifically saying, "Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." He eats a piece of broiled fish in front of them to prove his digestive system works. In John, he invites Thomas to thrust his hand into the gaping spear wound in his side.
It's gritty.
The tomb is empty because the physical corpse that was bleeding on Friday has been molecularly transformed into a glorified, immortal physical body. It is the defeat of death itself in the material universe.
And this event, the physical resurrection, is the keystone that locks the entire biblical narrative together. The source material provides a redemptive historical analysis, essentially zooming out to show us the grand tapestry. The Passion isn't just an isolated incident. It is the interpretive center of the entire Bible.
If you trace the narrative from Genesis to Revelation, everything funnels into the cross and flows out of the empty tomb. Let's trace the threads. Go back to the very beginning, Genesis chapter 3.
The Garden of Eden.
Humanity rebels, and God promises that the seed of the woman will eventually crush the head of the serpent, destroying evil, but in the process, his own heel will be violently struck. The cross is the ultimate fulfillment of that bruising strike and that crushing victory.
Then you move to Abraham.
God promises Abraham that through his family line, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. The texts argue that the cross is the mechanism that breaks open the exclusive covenant of Israel and offers that blessing of salvation to the entire globe.
And then Moses and the sacrificial system.
The entire Levitical system, the Passover lambs, the blood sprinkled on the altar, the Day of Atonement where the high priest lays the sins of the nation on a scapegoat and drives it into the wilderness.
All of that points forward.
The New Testament argues that those millions of animal sacrifices over centuries could never actually erase human guilt. They were just physical shadows pointing forward to the final, perfect, substitutionary sacrifice of the Son of God.
And finally, King David. The promise that a son of David would sit on an eternal throne.
The Passion narrative presents Jesus as the true king. But instead of riding a war horse and slaughtering his enemies with a sword, he rides a donkey, allows his enemies to slaughter him, is enthroned on a Roman cross, wears a crown of thorns, and is vindicated through resurrection to rule over the cosmos. It completely upends the human expectation of what power looks like.
It is an architectural masterpiece of literature and theology. Everything we've discussed, the limestone inscriptions, the brutal Roman politics, the psychological terror of the garden, the broken judicial system, and the empty tomb, it all builds to this single point. The Son of God dies for sinners, rises in victory, and launches a new creation.
It's breathtaking when you step back and look at it.
It really is. But I want to shift gears for our final moments. We've spent this entire time dissecting the mechanics of an event that happened 2,000 years ago. It's easy to treat this like a fascinating museum exhibit, but the source material refuses to stay in the past. It aggressively confronts the present. So for you listening right now, how does this ancient collision of empire and religion translate to someone today?
Well, it is profoundly disruptive to modern sensibilities. If you look at the practical theology of the Passion, it dismantles our current cultural operating systems. First, it elevates truth over power.
How so?
Pilate had all the leverage, the legions, and the political capital. Jesus had absolutely nothing but the truth. Our modern world is obsessed with optics, leverage, and acquiring power at all costs. The narrative of the Passion declares that worldly power is an illusion that rots, and truth is the only thing that outlasts empires.
It also elevates suffering over self-preservation. That is the massive friction point for us today.
We live in a culture that idolizes comfort, safety, and personal optimization. But the Jesus of the Gospels had the power to call down an army of angels to rescue himself. He could have compromised with Pilate or Caiaphas to save his own life.
But he didn't.
Instead, he willingly chose the absolute agony of the cross out of an obedient, sacrificial love for others. It redefines love not as a feeling, but as a willingness to bleed for the sake of another.
And it elevates forgiveness over vengeance. He's being tortured to death, choking on his own blood, and he looks down at the men hammering the nails and prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." It's the ultimate short circuit to the endless cycle of human retaliation.
It speaks directly against mob logic. Think about the crowds in Jerusalem shouting, "Crucify him." We see that exact same mob mentality today in cancel culture, in political tribalism, in performative religion.
It's human nature.
The Passion looks at all those deeply ingrained human tendencies, exposes them as utterly corrupt and capable of murdering the innocent, and offers a radically different way to exist. The text argues that the core problem of humanity isn't bad politics or poor education. The core problem is the profound corruption of the human heart.
You can't just pass a new law to fix it because the people who made the laws were the ones who orchestrated the crucifixion.
Exactly. The solution requires a completely different paradigm, a cruciform or cross-shaped view of life, where leadership is defined by washing feet, power is used to protect the vulnerable, and hope is anchored in the reality that death does not have the final word.
This has been a staggering journey. We've gone from the coastal ruins of Caesarea Maritima to the dense cosmic theology of the Gospel of John. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on the brutal sociology of the cross that we discussed earlier.
Okay, let's hear it.
Consider the profound psychological and historical shockwave of this narrative. For centuries, the cross was the absolute ultimate symbol of Roman terror. It was a billboard of shame, humiliation, and the total crushing defeat of the human spirit. It meant that the empire owned you, and you were less than dirt. Now, think about the undeniable historical fact that an entire global movement, arguably the most influential community in human history, built its absolute foundation not on an image of a conquering military hero holding a bloody sword, but by deliberately adopting the empire's most humiliating instrument of torture and execution. What does it do to the psychology of worldly power when a community takes your ultimate symbol of defeat, flips it completely upside down, and claims it as their ultimate symbol of cosmic victory?
It strips the empire of its ultimate weapon. It means the world is ultimately saved not by the infliction of violence, but by the suffering servant who absorbs it.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense deep dive into the historical and literary depths of the Passion. Keep questioning, keep exploring the sources, and keep seeking the connections beneath the surface of history. We'll see you next time.